Possibly around 4 o'clock this afternoon, perhaps, is when we think this journey will close for today, and then more commemorations to come. There are church services happening across the country today, but we here, of course, on BBC News will stay with you to follow this journey. We will bring you, of course, continuing coverage throughout the day here on BBC News. In the next few moments, we say goodbye for a period to viewers on BBC One, but there will be much more coverage of this on BBC One a little later on this afternoon. We will keep you across all of this on BBC News. And let's just remind ourselves of where this journey began this morning, about an hour and a half ago or so, as the Queen left her beloved home of Balmoral for the very last time. The Queen, who died at Balmoral on Thursday afternoon, and her coffin was driven through the gates there just about 10 o'clock this morning.
You're watching a special edition of BBC News where we're bringing you continuing coverage of a poignant day. The hearse bearing the coffin of Queen Elizabeth is making its journey from Balmoral to the Palace of Holyrood House in Edinburgh. I'm Joanna Gosling, and with my guests I'll be guiding you through the next hour. We see on these pictures coming to us many people lining the route for this solemn journey across 170 miles from Balmoral to the Palace of Holyrood House in Edinburgh, the official residence of the monarch in Scotland. And along the way, of course, there will be people who felt such a connection with her. There will also be people amongst them who will have met her, and particularly in Scotland, as we saw the cortege pass through Ballater, for instance, and many of the villages along the way. There will be people for whom the monarch, the Queen, will have been a familiar face. We've heard residents in Ballater talking about that being an environment where the royal family can effectively live a normal life, regular faces in the butchers, and it's for that reason that we know that it was a beloved residence of the Queen, a place where she could be a grandmother, a mother, a wife, and we heard earlier it being said that it was an environment where she effectively laid her crown at the gates as she went there, and that is where she spent her final summer, a summer where she also had official duties to uphold, the least not being the greeting of the new Prime Minister only this past week. Her final solemn and official duty being to see the outgoing Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and then welcome Liz Truss, the new Prime Minister, to form a new government. So as we watch this beautiful countryside as that cortege wends its way down the route from Balmoral to Edinburgh, with me here is Martin Geissler and my colleague from BBC Scotland, and also the historian Robert Lacey. Martin, all of these are events that we know are coming, and yet, nonetheless, each time we see the next step in these very carefully planned events, it's incredibly emotional, and it hits a little bit differently, doesn't it? I mean, this is the moment that we see the coffin carrying Her Majesty.
Yeah, we were talking about that earlier on, the finality of this. That's the sense you get, isn't it? And the planning that's gone into this for years, the inevitability, the increasing frailty of the Queen over the past year or so. We knew it was going to come at some point over the past few months, perhaps. It seemed to be not so far away, this moment. And suddenly, though, earlier this week, the finality of it has shocked a lot of people. And I think it also, even if you're not a monarchist, it reminds you of the fragility of life. And I've been struck by the number of people I've spoken to who've said they were surprised at how emotional they became, because it's reminded them of people they've lost mothers at the same age, or whatever. There's a lot of emotion in all of this. I mean, you can see we're passing. That was the village of Drumoak. It looked to me like that was the village of Drumoak that the cortege just passed through a minute ago. That the population's 800-900, and
perhaps they were all
seems
out
like
there.
that number of people on the pavements. I mean, there's evidence, and as people across Scotland watch these pictures, perhaps those who hadn't intended to be part of this today will be drawn out onto the streets. It's going to take 6 hours, or 5 hours now perhaps, to get from Deeside to Edinburgh, and there will be points along the way in Aberdeen and Dundee and in Edinburgh itself where people can come, and they've still got time to get there. It'll be interesting to see the scenes by 3-4 o'clock this afternoon when this convoy enters the streets of Scotland's capital, to see the crowds that are there to greet it.
Robert, it is that merging of something that feels deeply personal and that awareness that this is an extraordinary moment of history.
That's just what I was thinking, Joanna. There are different ways in which people encounter the Queen, head of state, from stamps and coins. Some people are lucky enough to meet her. There's the television. But certainly seeing her in that coffin, this is something none of us wanted. As I was saying earlier, we're also participating in a modern ritual. The first time this happened with a modern monarch, Queen Victoria, 1901, she died a long way away from London on the Isle of Wight. And all that the authorities thought about at the time, well, we've got to get the coffin up to Windsor to be buried. And so she was put on a warship, on a train up to one London terminal. What was that? That would have been Waterloo, and then popped across to another one, Paddington, to go to Windsor. My point being here that it just happened that between those two London terminals, railway terminals of Waterloo and Paddington, there was a chance for people to see the coffin. Wasn't planned, and not many people did. And now I think it shows, whether anti-monarchists like it or not, that the strength of the monarchy, that and of course the changing of media, that this now becomes a 10-day long event.
And it feels like a transition, that from that moment of the shock of the announcement to being able to watch, to connect as we see those very well-planned events unfolding, culminating, as you say, with the state funeral.
Yes, as Martin said, there are the personal feelings that anyone feels, death and funerals. But here it's translated into onto a national stage, and of course an international stage, because this woman commanded such extraordinary international respect, which grew during her life. I think the feeling was at the time of the coronation, well, this is lovely, it's a fairy tale, who knows what will come of it, but this woman grew the British monarchy and helped give Britain, once an empire, a new sort of role in the world.
James Cook is in Ballater, our Scotland editor. That's where the cortege passed through around 45 minutes ago. It's just 6 miles from Balmoral. And James, it's said that 1 in 3 people in this nation will have met the Queen or seen her. I imagine the numbers, almost everybody there in Ballater will have had some sort of an encounter or direct connection with the monarch and the family there at Balmoral.
Exactly, Joanna. Indeed, that's very, very striking that when you speak to people along the routes, I mean, almost everyone I spoke to had a personal experience, a personal story to tell, and usually involving the monarch's good humour, involving sometimes her wit, and stories about her time at in this village of about 1,400 or so people, particularly in 2015, when there were floods here in 2015, and the Queen came here a short time afterwards at the start of 2016, and really people were so deeply impressed by how much concern she showed for this community. I was speaking to a few people who literally had tears in their eyes as I was talking to them, recalling their memories of the Queen, and one woman who worked on the Balmoral estate telling me that of her concern for the corgis and what would happen to the corgis now, how they too would be missing the Queen. So it's really a sense of a normal person, which of course she wasn't in any meaningful sense. She was one of the most remarkable people of our age. But for the people here, she was relatively, and I wouldn't like to overstate this, but relatively normal in the sense that she was a neighbour, she could come here, she wouldn't be troubled if she did come here, and people here had a great deal of respect and affection for her.
And it feels particularly poignant that she passed away there at Balmoral, so that they do have this opportunity to say goodbye to someone who was so beloved in that area.
Yes, I think that's been extremely poignant and extremely important for people here to be able to do so. I think it matters a great deal to them that the Queen was here when she died. Most people here are very proud of their associations with the monarchy, dating back to Queen Victoria. In fact, you don't just hear stories about Queen Elizabeth here. You hear stories when you talk to people of Queen Victoria, and people mentioning things that they heard passed down that she reportedly said when she was in the village, a house that she liked. So, I mean, it really is a long relationship that goes way back to the 1850s, when the Balmoral Castle was built for Queen Victoria on this 50,000 acre estate. Now, I would just like to say Royal Deeside is not Scotland in miniature. There are other parts of the country that have a very different relationship with the monarchy, and indeed there's a lot of polling evidence that across Scotland the monarchy is relatively not as popular here as it is in England. I was speaking to the polling expert, Professor Sir John Curtis, recently, who was saying it's consistently over 50% support for the monarchy in England, quite a bit over, and consistently under 50% in Scotland. So, you know, it's with respectfully, that's not disrespectful to discuss this when we're talking, I don't think, about the monarch and her death, but I think it's worth reflecting.
Thank you. Just struck watching these pictures by the fact that at every possible point along the route where people can turn out, they have, and you see at the end of every driveway there are people standing there, and it does feel like as many people as are there have turned out for this moment in history, this moment to say thank you, this moment to say goodbye to a queen who served for 70 years. A young woman, when she ascended to the throne, it hadn't been her birth, a position she would have expected, of course, from birth. Her father was not supposed to be king, but the course of history was changed when Edward, the monarch, left the throne, having married Wallis Simpson, and then the baton of history was passed on to Queen Elizabeth, and for 70 years she served as queen, working right up to her death at Balmoral. And there, that's lovely, people on horseback as she goes by. That felt very special, didn't it, Martin, actually seeing that?
This is the town of Peter Cooter, or Cooter as it's known to the people who live there. Yeah, lovely tribute there from presumably the local pony club or whoever it is. Again, though, I mean, the scenes we saw, Joanna, in the middle of the town there, the pavements packed, these are not big conurbations. 4,000 population, Peter Cooter. Again, everybody seems to be out. And, you know...
And saluting.
Yeah. And these are not tourist towns. The people who we're seeing here are the people who live there. There's a group of scouts, I think, just saluting as the hearse goes past.
And absolute silence. Oh, there's some clapping there. But generally, people are just standing there with their own thoughts. We've seen a few flowers thrown into the path of the vehicle, but it is mostly just a really somber moment as people sort of in their own heads thinking their thoughts, sharing their gratitude for what she's done.
We were saying earlier, people who'd asked actually not to throw flowers specifically because of the difficulty of clearing the roads and the danger that could cause later on. But yeah, a kind of ripple of respectful applause is what we're seeing. I suspect that's what we'll see as well when they enter bigger cities.
Yes. Let's bring in Annita McVeigh, who's at Balmoral. Annita, you shared with us that moment at 10 o'clock this morning when the hearse carrying the Queen's coffin emerged from those gates. And it was, of course, such a sad moment to see that.
Joanna, it was, and what struck me most, in fact, was the simplicity of it, actually. The hearse carrying the coffin draped in the Royal Standard of Scotland and a single wreath on top of it. It will be a huge contrast to the solemn splendour of the state funeral when that happens in London. And we've been given some details of that wreath, the flowers that were on it, and also fir and pine, all of it cut here in the gardens and the forests around Balmoral. So there was a homely feeling to it because, of course, this was where the Queen felt most at home, everyone says. That simplicity in the wreath reflecting the simplicity of the life that she led here, that the royal family lead here. And I spoke to the Reverend David Barr, who is the minister of Glenmick Church in the centre of Ballater, where James Cook was speaking to you from a short while ago. And he said this to me. He said that when the Queen came to Balmoral, metaphorically, she hung her crown on the main gates. And here she was simply a wife, a mother, and later a grandmother and great-grandmother. It was a place where she could truly relax and feel free, although it's quite remarkable, isn't it, to reflect that just 5 days ago we did see those pictures of the Queen with Liz Truss, a moment of duty, still performing her duties 2 days before her death. And I think that's why so many people have said to me, you know, it doesn't seem real. Before this morning they were saying it doesn't seem real because we saw those images from Tuesday. It did seem sudden, didn't it? Even though she was 96, even though we knew she was frail, and she looked frail in those photographs, and there had been concerns about her health. Having just seen those images on Tuesday, it did come as a surprise to hear the news on Thursday that doctors were worried about her health, and to hear that members of the family were rushing to be here. But I think then that moment when we saw the hearse carrying the coffin emerge, that was something that was really tangible and really bringing home to people the death of the Queen, and also what that death represents, a huge change, having been monarch for 70 years. And the Reverend was saying to me, she has been a constant. Politicians have come and gone, but she has been a constant through times of turbulence, through different prime ministers. So I think this moment, and also this long journey now to Edinburgh, this slow, respectful journey, allowing people to see the coffin, will really start to bring home to people the passing of the Queen.
Annita, thank you. We are continuing to watch the Queen's cortege as it makes that solemn journey down from Balmoral, where it started out at 10 o'clock this morning, wending its way slowly across 170 miles of Scottish countryside to Edinburgh. And let me just take you to Edinburgh for a moment, because Edinburgh takes centre stage later when the coffin carrying Queen Elizabeth will arrive there. This journey expected to take about 6 hours. And before that, there will be 2 public ceremonies heralding the new King Charles III in Edinburgh. And we can show you the scene where we are expecting to hear that proclamation of Charles as the new king, and as you would expect, some ceremony there, the pomp and pageantry. This is such a merging, all of these events of the pomp, the pageantry, the ceremony, the constitutional matters, and also the people. And there is the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, surrounded by other dignitaries as they await that moment when His Majesty the King is formally declared head of state. This is all part of the process. Yesterday at St James's Palace in London, His Majesty was formally declared head of state, and we've seen similar proclamations in Commonwealth nations, and they will be happening across the nations of the United Kingdom also. And this happening as the cortege carrying the Queen continues, and all along the route we are seeing people standing at the end of their driveways, standing alongside the road, wherever they can get to pay their respects to the Queen. We're speaking to Martin Geissler, my colleague, who was saying these are not heavily populated areas, and it does seem that almost every person in these small towns has turned out to pay their respects. The next big stop that there will be Aberdeen, and that will be an opportunity for many more to turn out and pay their respects. But there is that sense that this is a moment when people of this area can show their gratitude for someone who was such a known figure in the area. I mean, of course, she was known globally, but perhaps in a different way, because this was somewhere where it said at Balmoral that she and the rest of the royal family could effectively live almost a normal life in the seclusion of that environment where they'd been known. They were just, it seems, treated as members of the community, in particular in the local town where it said they'd be seen just going about doing their shopping duties, going to the butchers. It's hard to imagine, isn't it, when we see the life that the royals live, and but that is indeed apparently what they would do up there. The Queen would go to the butchers. There is one anecdote you may well have heard. It's been told many times. It's not mine to tell, but I'll summarise it because it's a lovely anecdote that illustrates the life that she led there at Balmoral, and it was that she was out on a picnic with one of her trusted people from Balmoral. They were walking and saw 2 American tourists who were delighted to see some people there and said, "Oh, I gather the Queen lives near here." And they didn't recognise her. They ended up taking a picture with her, and apparently she said as they went off, "I can't wait till they show that picture to their friends back home." and they realised they did actually meet the Queen, which is what they'd been hoping to do, and they didn't realise they had done it. So a modest account, really, of her, how down-to-earth she could be, and also that sense of humour. And with me, Frank Gardner, our security correspondent. And Frank, I know that you've got some memories that you want to share of the Queen.
Yeah, I mean, I was lucky enough to meet her on 7 occasions, and what always struck me is what an extraordinarily good listener she was. She wasn't going through the motions. She was genuinely interested in people. So she gave me my OBE for services to journalism back in 2005, and I was staggering along with my calipers and frame because I'd been shot the year before. And she inquired after my health and whether it was permanent, and she said, well, how very gallant of you to make the effort to stand up here, which was lovely. Years later, I was part of a charity and I met her at Windsor. And I said, do you realise, Your Majesty, that you gave me my OBE exactly 50 years after you gave my grandfather his OBE for services to forestry in 1955. Think of that, same sovereign. She said, tell me about it, which I thought was really lovely, with a twinkle in her eye. And, I think often, up until recently, people have perhaps laboured under the misapprehension that she's this sort of rather austere, remote person. Quite the opposite. She had a really keen sense of humour. And once, and by the way, just to be clear, I've cleared these anecdotes with the palace.
You ran into some trouble before, didn't you?
Yeah, well, let's
You're
not
allowed to tell anecdotes.
Let's not go there. So I've cleared it with the palace, and they're more than happy for me to recount this on this occasion. And I was lucky enough to have lunch with her in the palace. There were other people present, and we were discussing the Middle East and Oman. And at the time, Sultan Qaboos was on the throne. This was, I think, 2008. And she said, I rather liked the previous sultan, but I suppose he just grew out of touch with his people and got deposed by his son. Perhaps it'll happen to me. I thought that was so wonderful.
That humour, though, I mean, obviously that you had the chance to experience that at first hand. Many had the chance to, that privilege to share it at first hand. And as we've just alluded to, I mean, a lot cannot be shared. We know that the audiences that the Prime Minister's had with the Queen, they're unable to share.
Which will forever remain secret.
Exactly, and for reasons of, yes, it's an important thing for the Prime Minister to be able to have that privilege of being able to speak privately, as for her. But also there are obviously a lot of anecdotes that are shared. And also we have the things that were on display for all of us, those moments that, for instance, the filming with Paddington.
Just brilliant.
For the
I have
Jubilee.
to say, I think of all the messages and photographs posted, the one that brings a tear, I think, to many people's eyes is the ones that many people have left a little wrapped sandwich saying, for later.
Oh, the way she said that, I can't watch that enough.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Well, it did remind us that people, I mean, it's so nice, Frank, to hear a funny story because everybody says, oh, she had a wonderful sense of humour, and then there's a sort of silence and we don't hear the joke. And I think what the Paddington episode, along with the James Bond episode earlier in 2012, showed us, the general public, the sort of experience the royal family had privately, that she was a great mimic. We heard earlier on Laura Kinsberg's programme, we heard Gordon Brown chuckling over the fact that she liked to imitate his Scottish accent brilliantly. Not to him, apparently, but he'd heard of it. But as you were saying, Joanna, the essence of her constitutional job meant that these possibly contentious or overhuman stories had to remain silent until later, because the solemn and ultimately crucial thing that she did was to be our representative and independent and non-political head of state, while the politicians squabbled about the rest of life.
A very human who transcended us all. Let's go back to Edinburgh, and this is where we are awaiting one of the ceremonial moments. This is going to be the proclamation of King Charles as the new monarch. Of course, he was king from the moment his mother died, but there is the constitutional matter of those proclamations of him as king, and we've been seeing these proclamations rolling out in London at St James's Palace. There was the proclamation yesterday. There have subsequently been proclamations in a number of Commonwealth countries, New Zealand, Canada, Australia amongst them, and those will continue, and they're happening in all the nations of the United Kingdom. And there are also actually proclamations across the counties of this country as well. Robert, tell us a bit more about why these have to happen, because obviously he became king immediately, but this is about constitutional matters and that handover.
Yes, because the Queen and now King Charles are head of state, not just of the component parts of the United Kingdom, but of, I think it's now 14 realms around the world. I think most people are familiar with the Commonwealth, the 50 or so nations that make up what we now call the family of nations, the former colonies, India, Pakistan, and Australia and Canada. But Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the other realms, REALMS, have the Queen as head of state as well, and now Prince Charles.
Quiet for a moment to hear the proclamation in Edinburgh.
Whereas it has pleased Almighty God to call to his mercy our late Sovereign Lady Queen Elizabeth II, of blessed and glorious memory, by whose decease the crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is solely and rightfully come to the Prince Charles Philip Arthur George. We therefore, the Lords Spiritual and Temporal of this realm, and members of the House of Commons, together with other members of Her late Majesty's Privy Council, and representatives of the realms and territories, aldermen and citizens of London and others, do now hereby with one voice and consent of tongue and heart publish and proclaim that the Prince Charles Philip Arthur George is now, by the death of our late sovereign, happy of memory, become our only lawful and rightful liege lord, Charles III, by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and of his other realms and territories, King, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith, to whom we do acknowledge all faith and allegiance with humble affection, beseeching God, by whom kings and queens do reign, to bless his majesty with long and happy years to reign over us. Given at St James's Palace on the 10th day of September, and in the year of our Lord 2022. cheers for His Majesty the King. Hip hip! Hip hip! Hip hip!
And there was that 21-gun salute after the official proclamation in Edinburgh, and now we see the outriders arriving in Aberdeen, which is where the cortege is imminently going to be arriving. And we can see a large crowd gathered there, some holding flags aloft, and silence really otherwise. So much respect being shown along the route. This 170-mile route that is being driven that would normally take around 3 hours or so. There we see the hearse with the coffin carrying the Queen. Moving slowly so that all of those who have turned out to show their respects have that opportunity. And along the way we have seen so many people turning out in areas that small populations, and at points it's felt like all the houses were empty as the people turned out on this clear but sad day to see the coffin carrying the Queen transported initially to Edinburgh and then subsequently to be taken to London for that state funeral that will happen on the 19th of September. Well, let us go to Windsor, which is where the Queen was in residence prior to going to her home at Balmoral. And our correspondent Duncan Kennedy is there. Duncan.
Yes, well, the incredible scenes that you've been witnessing there in Edinburgh are about to be repeated here in Windsor, but on a much more intimate level. Whereas you had the wide city of Edinburgh coming together, here it's the small town of Windsor, population normally about 30,000, although that may have doubled, even trebled by what the local council are telling us. In fact, they're asking people to stay away at the moment. So crammed is Windsor for this proclamation, and of course for this continuation of the laying of the flowers at the gates of Windsor Castle. The proclamation itself is taking place just behind me here at the statue of Queen Victoria. As I say, a much more intimate one. Ever since the original proclamation yesterday at St James's Palace, it's like a stone has been dropped in a pond, and the concentric circles of these proclamations are reverberating right throughout the country. Big places like Edinburgh, smaller places like here in Windsor. So, for example, we'll have the local mayor here, Councillor Christine Bateson, who'll make the opening remarks, and then the town crier, Chris Brown, he'll make the same speech that you've just heard there in Edinburgh, ending with the words, "God save the King." Then we'll have the Royal Household Cavalry playing the national anthem, and then again, just as you heard in Edinburgh there, there'll be 3 cheers for God save the King. This small ceremony taking place over the course of 10 or 15 minutes, and then the town again bursting into life. There's almost a pedestrian flow being organised here. Such are the numbers here, and people will continue from the statue ceremony over to the Long Walk, which is where we have this huge number of people laying down their flowers, laying down their Paddington bears. The scene, of course, yesterday are those extraordinary moments when the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, and of course William and Kate came out, much to everybody's surprise. People still talking about that this morning. They simply couldn't believe that the couple had come together to mark the occasion of the passing of the Queen. They saw them go into the crowd. Some people I met this morning were here yesterday. They had shaken the hand of Meghan, one of them. Another had taken a photograph of William and Kate as they went by. So right across the country, these proclamations, and also in various places, particularly focal points like here in Windsor, the laying of these flowers, which continues day in and day out. I would estimate that something like 1,000 people every 5 minutes, according to one of the officials there, are filing past the Cambridge Gate, which is on the other side of the castle, to lay their flowers. They're being asked to move on quite swiftly, just to think about what they are saying, pause for a moment to reflect, and then to move on and let others take their place. So remarkable scenes from all the way up in Edinburgh right down to here in Berkshire as the commemorations, the memorial services, the remembrance of the Queen take place right across the country.
Duncan, thank you very much. Windsor, of course, a place so important for the Queen, Windsor Castle, an environment, of course, where she was known well, being a resident. This is one of the other key residences, of course, Buckingham Palace, the Royal Standard flying at full mast over the palace, the flags lining the Mall, and that is a place where the people have been coming also in there, thousands and thousands, to pay their respects. The notice announcing the passing of the Queen was put on the gates of Buckingham Palace, and people have been coming there initially to put flowers on the railings, the gates, on the pathway in front of the palace, all around the fountain, but they've subsequently been moved across to a flower garden, which is just off to the right on this picture, Green Park, and that is where there is effectively now a garden of remembrance with thousands and thousands of floral tributes. And Duncan was mentioning there, Paddington bears have been left behind. There were also pictures that people have put of themselves with the Queen, because across that 70-year reign, of course, so many people in this country have met the Queen, may have a direct link through one way or another with someone for whom she was important, perhaps they have a link to somebody who worked in one of the residences. And actually, I can talk now to somebody who is in that position. It's David Cobban. He's a businessman in Ballater and organiser of the Ballater Platinum Jubilee events, but also, David, a direct connection for you with the Queen, in that your mother actually worked, I think, as a cleaner at Balmoral, and your father worked on the estate in the 1970s.
Yes, my mother worked for 2 or 3 seasons in the castle in the 70s, but my father worked on the estate in the early 50s. He served his time in the gardens at Balmoral as well, so there's a connection way back then.
And so she is our Queen. She is, to so many people, something that they knew on a more personal level, I suppose. I mean, how do you feel about your relationship with the Queen and your encounters over the years, not just with the Queen, but I know also you've worked with our new King, King Charles III.
Yes, it is a very personal thing in Ballater and up here in Deeside. Many people work on the estate. They've got, regular contact with the royal family, and many people there will have known the Queen personally, and even our involvement in the village here with the contact that we've had with the Queen and the royal family is very special. So it's become a personal loss here. You'll find that the emotions of people are very high, and they've all got their own personal stories to remember the Queen by, and I think they'll cherish them even more now. So yes, the mood here has been quite emotional, really. I think people find that in the next few days we'll realise the real loss of the Queen.
And we're seeing the cortege as it moves so slowly to allow people to pay their respects. And there's absolute silence as we see the cortege pass through. Can you just describe what it felt like to be there?
Yes, there were a lot of people in Ballater this morning waiting for the cortege, and I'm not sure any of us knew what to expect, really. It was a strange feeling, I have to say. The village fell silent a few minutes before the cortege arrived, almost sensing something, and the silence as it passed through was incredible. You could have heard a pin drop, and I think that's just a true reflection of the sincerity of everybody that was there and how they were feeling about it as she passed by for the last time.
And you spoke of those very personal moments. I think that you had one of those in 2015 when there was a terrible time for Ballater, hit by floods, and the Queen actually, I think, came into your shop.
Yes, that's right. The shop was badly damaged in the flood. Many shops along the main street were damaged, and a few months later she came down to the village to offer her support and to thank a lot of people who had helped during the floods. So she came into the shop to talk to my wife and I, and it was a very a remarkable occasion for us, obviously, but our nerves disappeared the minute she stepped in the door and started to chat away, and she was genuinely concerned and caring about how we'd managed to cope after the flood. And she walked through the village that day with the same conversations with many people. It gave the village a real lift, and I think that was the reason she came, to show her support. So it was a nice moment, a moment that a lot of people here, will cherish. They remember it well. So yes, she's done a lot in this area for us.
Thank you very much indeed, David Cobban, sharing some of your memories that, as you say, you will cherish. We're watching pictures coming to us live from Edinburgh Castle. We've been watching the ceremony of the proclamation, which is the moment when Scotland has proclaimed King Charles III as monarch. Sarah Smith is in Edinburgh for us. Sarah.
Hello, yes, we've heard the proclamation, read once there, and the Lord Lion is now making his way up to the drawbridge at Edinburgh Castle, where King Charles will once again be proclaimed the sovereign, and you will see some more of that ceremony there. He has, of course, been sovereign since his mother died, but this is the official moment when the people of Scotland are informed that Charles has now become their king. And you could see how deep the crowds were on the Royal Mile there watching that ceremony earlier today. And they will be lining the whole of that street, which runs from Edinburgh Castle, just about exactly a mile long, right down through Edinburgh's Old Town, here to Holyrood House, to the palace, which was, of course, the Queen's official residence when she was in Edinburgh and will now be King Charles's residence. Now, he's not here at the moment. King Charles and Queen Consort Camilla will be making their way up to Edinburgh tomorrow. But we do understand that the other senior members of the royal family who were at Balmoral have left there now. We've seen one helicopter arrive here already, so we think that may have been carrying some members of the royal family as they gather here at the Palace of Holyrood House. And about 4 o'clock or so, we're expecting the hearse carrying the Queen's coffin to arrive in Edinburgh. We'll come through the streets of Edinburgh, all of which have been lined with crash barriers because they're expecting large crowds to come out and watch the coffin process through the streets of Edinburgh. All the political leaders of Scotland will be gathered in front of the Holyrood Parliament. The First Minister Nicola Sturgeon and all the other party leaders will be there to pay their respects as the hearse goes past and into the Palace of Holyrood House, which is, of course, just opposite the Scottish Parliament. And there, the Queen's coffin will stay overnight before some of the ceremonies start again tomorrow. There will be a procession from the palace back up the Royal Mile to St Giles Cathedral. King Charles will be following on foot behind the hearse, other members of the royal family in cars, and they will go to St Giles Cathedral, where there will be a service of remembrance. After that, the Queen will then lie in state in St Giles Cathedral for 24 hours, where members of the public will be able to come through and pay their respects in the cathedral before she's then moved to London.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So that description of what will be happening in the days ahead and also what is happening today, and one of those proclamation ceremonies being held in Cardiff, and this is the scene from there, the proclamation ceremony at Cardiff Castle. And it is, as mentioned, one of several which has been happening across the United Kingdom at the same time, also in Northern Ireland. And yesterday we had the ceremony in London, and there have also been ceremonies across Commonwealth nations. And on Friday, King Charles will be visiting Wales as monarch, visiting Cardiff with Queen Consort Camilla. That is part of a tour of the nations of the United Kingdom ahead of the funeral of his mother on the 19th of September. So this, the scene in Cardiff Castle. About 2,000 members of the public were invited to attend the ceremony. People could apply. It was on a first-come, first-served basis. And then, of course, there are dignitaries in attendance for this ceremony, at which the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, calls upon Wales Herald Thomas Lloyd OBE to read the proclamation in English, and then it will subsequently be read in Welsh, followed by a 21-gun salute, as we also saw in Edinburgh, and then the national anthem. And they're preparing for that 21-gun salute. And so all of these events, part of a very well-organised rollout of the key moments that happen on the passing of one monarch and the handing over to the new monarch, from the Elizabethan era to the Carolean era. and so many people turning out to see these historic events unfolding.
As the one person around the table who was alive when the Queen came to the throne, I suspect, being older than you, I have vague memories of these things happening at the accession of Queen Elizabeth II. But there's two things that are different. One is the popular participation in all of these events now, as opposed to then, and made possible, of course, by television, but I think reflecting personal tributes to what people particularly feel to this Queen. The other, I suppose, is the slight sense of danger that back in 1952, there was no thought that the British Isles would ever split up. There was no talk of devolution. I mean, there were football matches between England and Scotland that everybody was, took sides. But the idea that, well, two things, I suppose. The idea that by the next century, Britain would be both divided and kept together through a new system, so that all these ceremonies have so much more importance. Didn't occur to us then, but it is the Queen, and I would venture to say the royal family and King Charles III, who within this experience of separation maintained togetherness. And it's the same thing that happened with the Commonwealth. The Queen's reign, we saw all these ex-colonies depart in what could have been bitterness, and yet the Commonwealth, through the personality of the Queen and what she stood for, not just her, but the whole system that she embodied, kept its togetherness and its meaning. And I think that's what we're seeing now with these people out on the streets and the mixture of ancient ceremony at the same time.
And you indicate, of course, there, Robert, of how much has changed in that time. And she was the person who led us through all of that, who saw so much, had so much wisdom to share.
She always carried a sense of gravitas, of weight. You earlier said that she wasn't born to be queen. When she was born, she was the equivalent of Princess Beatrice or Eugenie, a charming younger member of the royal family. Then events, the abdication, threw her into the path of history. But I think what she learnt in those early years, when there was no serious prospect of her becoming queen, then was the possibility a brother would come along that would in those days have jumped over her. That's something that's changed in her reign. When she came to the throne, at that time, the succession gave priority to males. It's under Queen Elizabeth II that it has become such that Princess Charlotte might, in certain circumstances, inherit a head of her younger brother, which wouldn't have been the case. We are experiencing history. We're looking at so much, and it is this weird mixture. Well, not to say weird, that sounds disrespectful, but non-British people will laugh at it. This is what Britain's all about now.
And it's the ceremony, the constitutional matters, the pomp, the pageantry, and Martin, what we've been seeing with the cortege as it passes through from Balmoral down to Edinburgh with people turning out. It's about the people as well, and that connection of the monarch with her people and now with his people.
That's what struck me about what Robert's just been saying, the fact that this last time round, you dig back deep into the reservoirs of your memory, you can remember this happening, but without the specific involvement of the public. It seems extraordinary that this would happen as, isolated ceremonies that were for the royals and by the royals and only involving people who were connected to them. It seems extraordinary and impossible now to think that it would not be deliberately designed to involve members of the public and almost before, as this is today, members of the public, an opportunity for them to come out and say farewell and
I didn't want to suggest that back in the 1950s people didn't care or weren't involved, but there were so many more ways. There are so many more ways now that everybody can experience what's going on. Most notably television, which of course made its brilliant debut, although controversial debut in those days, at the Queen's coronation in 1953.
Yeah. And we see how enthusiastically the public embrace the opportunity to do this today. We've seen it on Deeside, we've seen it in Aberdeen.
There are people on a motorway bridge.
I can see pictures on another monitor, yeah, of the convoy passing now Stonehaven, just south of Aberdeen, and the motorway bridges being lined. I have to confess I didn't know necessarily what the size of the crowds would be in this part of Scotland, and when it made its way down. It's going to now go between the area, the 60-odd miles between Aberdeen and Dundee is largely rural, and I thought we would be looking at pictures just of roads and hills and fields, but actually it seems that on the bridges, on the grass verges at the side of the road, we're seeing quite extraordinary numbers of people. We'll, I'm sure, come back to this at some point.
Maybe even something to do with us. As you were saying, there's been very short notice of this, but the last few hours, people have seen the BBC, maybe reminded them of the chance to come out and catch this last glimpse,
indeed,
of their sovereign.
And there is a dual purpose, isn't there? It's to see an event, it's to witness a moment in history, but it is also to pay respects. And I think it's unavoidable, if you are there even just to see the event, to be part of this. When that hearse goes by with the coffin draped in the Scottish standards, there is a sense of finality, and it does feel profound, and it does feel deep, and it does feel extremely meaningful, and no matter what you expect it to feel, I suspect, you will feel something different when you witness it. They've just passed Stonehaven, I think, by the look of this road, which will, this is the A90. They're travelling on the main road down the east coast. If you're travelling from Edinburgh up to Aberdeen, if you've ever taken that route, you'll know this road. It travels through outskirts of Perth and then through Dundee and then up to Aberdeen. This convoy is doing it in reverse, so they'll pass Brechin and Forfar and just nearby Glamis Castle. We'll touch on that. There's the coastline. Dunnottar Castle just in the distance there. Magnificent part of Scotland.
And what a poignant day is this. We have continuing coverage. And welcome to this BBC News special, where we are bringing you continuing coverage of an extremely poignant day. The hearse bearing the Queen's coffin left Balmoral several hours ago.